Welcome back to Historia Prime. In 2004, on the big island of Hawaii, something bizarre started happening. Residents across rural neighborhoods began firing up their leaf blowers in the middle of the night. But they weren't clearing leaves. They were shooting massive clouds of white powder into the jungle. The target, millions of tiny invasive coqui frogs whose deafening calls were driving the island mad. Within weeks, the Hawaii Department of Agriculture intervened. Not because of the frogs, because the powder was burning the skin and eyes of neighbors, pets, and anyone caught downwind. The state threatened fines of up to $5,000 per violation. The powder wasn't a pesticide. It wasn't an illegal chemical. It was a $3 bag of white dust from the local hardware store. And right now, thousands of homeowners across America are spreading that exact same dust in the dark, crawl spaces directly beneath their children's bedrooms because the internet told them it was a miracle cure for humidity. Today, on Historia Prime, we're going to follow the trail of this ancient powder from the monumental engineering of Rome to the jungles of the ancient Maya, and finally down into the damp foundation of your own home. We're going to separate myth from chemistry and find out why a substance that once built empires could quietly be destroying yours. Let's begin. Part 1. The $3 Miracle. The powder is calcium hydroxide. You might know it as hydrated lime or slaked lime. It's been sitting on hardware store shelves for decades, right next to the concrete mix and the joint compound. £50 for a few dollars. Nobody looks at it twice. But if you spend any time on DIY forums or home improvement blogs, you'll eventually run into someone who swears by it. Their story always goes something like this. Instead of paying $5,000 or $10,000 for a professional crawl space encapsulation, they bought a few bags of this ancient powder, spread it across the dirt floor, and their moisture problem simply vanished. Forever. The narrative is powerful because it taps into something we all feel. The modern waterproofing industry in America generates billions of dollars a year. Dehumidifier manufacturers rake in billions more. When someone tells you that all of those companies are suppressing a $3 permanent fix, it feels like rebellion to walk into the hardware store and outsmart the whole system. But here's what nobody on those forums is asking. If this powder is so miraculous, how did the people who actually invented it use it 10,000 years ago? Did they use it to magically dry out enclosed spaces? Or was their genius rooted in something we've completely misunderstood? To find out, we need to go back to the very beginning. Part 2. The Alchemists of Antiquity. The story of lime begins at least 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest building materials in human civilization. Older than metal, older than glass, second only to mud and raw stone. Imagine this. A group of our ancestors, somewhere in the ancient Near East, builds a fire pit using stones gathered from the earth. They don't know it, but some of those stones are limestone. The fire burns through the night, hotter than any cooking fire they've ever built. By morning, something has changed. The stones look different. They feel lighter, more fragile. Then it rains, and when that water hits the burnt stones, the ground erupts. Steam hisses violently. The rock cracks and crumbles into a soft, boiling white paste. The people jump back in terror, but eventually someone is brave enough or curious enough to touch it. And they discover that this strange paste can be shaped, spread, and that when it dries, it turns back into stone. That accidental discovery changed the trajectory of human civilization. Thousands of miles away and thousands of years later, the ancient Maya took lime and pushed it to extraordinary heights. In the dense, humid jungles of Mesoamerica, where moisture breeds disease and decay at terrifying speed, lime wasn't a luxury. It was survival. The Maya plastered their plazas and living floors with lime, creating surfaces with a pH of around 12, which is almost as alkaline as bleach. This wasn't decoration. In densely packed jungle settlements with no modern sanitation, this highly alkaline surface killed pathogens on contact. It gave them clean, easily swept living spaces in an environment that was constantly trying to rot everything around them. But the Maya did something even more astonishing. They used lime to literally keep their civilization from going insane. Through a process called nixtamalization, they soaked hard maize kernels in lime-infused water. This softened the food, yes, but more critically, it unlocked a hidden nutrient called niacin, which the human body cannot absorb from raw corn. Without this ancient chemistry, populations that depended on maize would have suffered from pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease that causes skin lesions, chronic diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death. Lime didn't just build their cities, it kept an entire civilization alive and sane. Across the world, the Romans took lime in a completely different direction. The Roman architect, Vitruvius, documented a fundamental problem. Standard air lime mortars crumbled in the presence of extreme moisture. They were useless for anything underwater. So Roman engineers did what Roman engineers always did. They innovated. They combined hydrated lime with volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, and crushed ceramics. This created something extraordinary, a chemical matrix called calcium silicate hydrate that could cure and harden even while fully submerged in water. This is how they built their legendary naval ports, their miles of underground sewers, and aqueducts that still stand 2,000 years later. The ancients understood lime deeply. They respected it. They built entire civilizations around it. But not one of them ever used it to kill humidity in the air. To understand why, we need to look at the chemistry. Part 3. The lime cycle. The chemistry of lime follows a beautiful three-stage journey that the ancients mastered through millennia of trial and error. It's called the lime cycle. Stage 1. Calcination. You take calcium carbonate, that's limestone or even seashells, and burn it in a kiln at over 900 degrees Celsius. That extreme heat drives out the carbon dioxide and leaves behind a highly unstable, violently reactive substance called calcium oxide, or quicklime. Stage 2. Hydration. When you add water to quicklime, it erupts, it boils, it steams. The heat produced is so intense it can set wood on fire. Once the violent reaction stops, you're left with calcium hydroxide, hydrated lime. And this is the $3 powder on the hardware store shelf. Stage 3. Carbonation. When this hydrated lime is exposed to air, it slowly absorbs carbon dioxide and hardens, returning to its original state as solid limestone. In other words, it turns back into rock. This third stage is where the internet myth was born. People look at this reaction and think, the powder is sucking moisture out of the air to turn into stone. It's permanently destroying humidity. But if you look at the actual chemistry, something deeply ironic is hiding in plain sight. Part 4. The Great Deception. Look at the balanced chemical equation for the carbonation of hydrated lime. On the left side of the equation, calcium hydroxide plus carbon dioxide. On the right side, solid limestone. And one more thing, a byproduct, a molecule that, if your entire goal is to dry out a damp basement, is the very last thing you ever want to see. Water. The reaction that people claim kills humidity actually creates water molecules. For every molecule of CO2 that the lime pulls from the air, it releases one molecule of H2O right back into it. Now this is where the confusion starts. The raw, unslaked quicklime from stage 1 of the lime cycle is indeed an aggressive desiccant. It violently devours water, but by the time it reaches the hardware store as hydrated lime, it has already consumed that water. It is the chemically spent version of a drying agent. Buying hydrated lime to absorb moisture is like buying a used sponge that's already soaking wet and expecting it to dry your floor. And even if the carbonation reaction did help, it barely works in practice. When you spread the powder across a floor, the surface reacts with the air and forms a thin crust of limestone. This crust seals off the powder underneath, a phenomenon scientists call surface passivation. Within hours, the reaction stops completely. You're left with a useless pile of crusty powder that has done almost nothing to the humidity in your home. Compare this to real desiccants. Calcium chloride, an entirely different salt, is so hungry for water that it actually dissolves itself into a liquid brine, absorbing 2 to 6 times its own weight in moisture. Silica gel uses billions of microscopic pores to physically trap water vapor, absorbing up to 40% of its weight, and can be baked in an oven and reused over and over again. Hydrated lime absorbs less than 5% of its weight, produces water as a byproduct, and can never be reused. Historical naval records confirm this. While lime was occasionally used to dry enclosed shipboard spaces in earlier centuries, it was eventually abandoned entirely in favor of far superior materials. So here is the question that matters. If lime doesn't actually work, why do so many people go online and swear that it fixed their crawl space? Part 5. The Silent Crisis. This is where the psychology of home ownership meets the biology of decay, and this is where the real danger begins. When your basement or crawl space is damp, the most obvious symptom isn't something you see, it's something you smell. That musty, earthy, terrible odor that creeps up through your floorboards. That smell is the off-gassing of bacteria, mold, and decay fungi that are quietly feasting on the wooden bones of your house. When a homeowner throws hydrated lime all over the dirt floor, something immediate does happen. The lime, with a pH above 12, instantly kills the bacteria and mold spores living on the surface of the soil. The musty odor vanishes. The homeowner walks down, takes a deep breath, smells clean air, and declares victory. They go online and write a glowing 5-star review about the $3 miracle. But they have made a catastrophic mistake. They have silenced the alarm while the fire rages on. The lime neutralized the odor, but it did absolutely nothing to stop the source of the moisture. The water is still evaporating from the earth below. It's still seeping through the concrete foundation, and most dangerously, it is still being absorbed by the wooden floor joists above. Wood is an organic sponge. When the relative humidity in a dark, unventilated space consistently exceeds 70%, decay fungi invade the wood fibers. This is commonly called dry rot, which is an incredibly misleading name because it actually requires immense amounts of moisture. These fungi literally eat the cellulose that gives your home its structural strength, leaving behind wood that crumbles like stale bread. Because the lime killed the warning smell, the homeowner has no idea this is happening. The first sign that the miracle powder failed comes years later. The floorboards begin to sag underfoot. Doors start sticking in their frames. And then a structural engineer crawls underneath the house, shines a flashlight on the joists, and hands them an estimate. $35,000 to rip out and replace the rotted skeleton of their home. And the structural damage isn't even the most frightening part. Part 6. An ancient weapon under your floor. There is a chapter in the history of lime that most people have never heard, and it changes everything about how you should think about this powder. During the wars of antiquity, stretching from the late BCE period into the Middle Ages, military commanders discovered that the violent chemistry of the lime cycle could be turned into a weapon. In naval combat, soldiers filled clay pots with fine lime dust. Using catapults, or sometimes just their bare hands, they hurled these pots onto the decks of enemy ships. When the pots shattered, a massive white cloud engulfed the sailors. The dust settled on their sweating skin. It drifted into their open eyes, and the moment it met moisture, the highly alkaline exothermic reaction ignited. it burned. Entire crews were permanently blinded and incapacitated without a single sword being drawn. That was 2,000 years ago on open water in the wind. Now bring that chemistry indoors. Picture your home. Building science describes a phenomenon called the stack effect. As warm air rises through your house and escapes through the roof, it creates a pressure vacuum at the bottom. Studies estimate that up to 50% of the air you breathe on your first floor is being actively pulled up from the basement or crawl space below. If you have loose lime powder down there, every time your HVAC kicks on, every time a gust of wind hits the foundation vents, every time a stray animal scurries through, microscopic particles of this highly caustic dust go airborne. They are drawn up through the gaps in your floorboards, through the ductwork, and directly into the lungs of your family. Part 7. Banned or just misunderstood? So is this powder actually banned? Is there a grand corporate conspiracy to suppress it? No. Hydrated lime is manufactured by the millions of tons worldwide for water treatment, steel production, and agriculture. You can buy it for a few dollars because it is a raw industrial material designed for trained professionals, not a consumer product. But the safety warnings and restrictions are very real. OSHA strictly regulates lime dust in the workplace because it is a severe irritant to the eyes, skin, and respiratory tract. Prolonged inhalation can cause chemical bronchitis, fluid in the lungs, and permanent scarring known as pneumoconiosis. Remember those residents in Hawaii with the leaf blowers? The state didn't threaten them with $5,000 fines because of the frogs. They did it because clouds of caustic dust were a public health emergency for every human and animal in the surrounding neighborhoods. When professional waterproofing companies recommend heavy-duty vapor barriers and mechanical dehumidifiers instead of lime, they aren't just trying to upcharge you. They're providing solutions that actually stop the water at its source, solutions that don't create a toxic dust hazard and expose them to massive legal liability if a child or pet breathes in the caustic powder. Part 8. What the ancients actually knew. So were the ancients wrong about lime? Not even close. We just misread their genius. The Romans never used lime to chemically eliminate humidity. They used it to build structures that could breathe. Think about how modern buildings work. Portland cement and synthetic paints are highly impermeable. They create walls that trap moisture inside. When water inevitably gets in, whether from rain, from condensation, from a tiny crack, it has nowhere to go. It sits there and breeds rot and mold. Traditional lime plasters and mortars are the exact opposite. They possess a quality called hygric buffering. A lime-plastered wall is vapor open. It acts like a living lung for the building. When the air is humid, the wall draws moisture into its microscopic pores and holds it safely, without deteriorating. When the air dries out, the wall gently releases that moisture back. This continuous breathing prevents condensation from ever forming on the surface, which naturally stops mold and mildew before they can begin. The genius of ancient builders wasn't that they found a magic powder to destroy water. It's that they designed buildings to live in harmony with water, rather than waging an impossible war against it. History is filled with extraordinary innovations, but it is also filled with cautionary tales about what happens when we grab a fragment of ancient wisdom without understanding the whole picture. Calcium hydroxide is a genuine marvel of chemistry. It built empires. It sanitized cities in the jungle. It kept entire civilizations from starving. And it remains a cornerstone of modern industry to this day. But it is also a caustic, water-producing chemical that was once used to blind enemy sailors and that can scar your lungs and mask the slow, invisible collapse of your home's foundation. If your home is suffering from dampness, look to the true lessons of building science, not the romantic myth of a $3 secret. Control the water at the source by fixing your drainage and grading. create physical barriers to block ground moisture from rising, and use safe mechanical ventilation or dehumidification to protect your air quality. The ancients didn't try to kill the water, they learned to breathe with it. And after 10,000 years, the walls they built are still standing. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this exploration of history and science valuable, please leave a like, subscribe to Historia Prime, and tell me in the comments what other ancient myths or forgotten survival skills should we investigate next. Until next time, keep questioning the past and stay curious.